Ja, välkomna allihopa till det här webbinariumet om kärnvapen, klimat och katastrofmedicin. Jag heter Åsa Lindström och är styrelsemedlem i Svenska Läkare mot kärnvapen som arrangerar det här webbinariet. Jag tänkte bara kolla, ser alla PowerPointen om SLMK nu? Så att det är rätt bild som syns. Ja, härligt. Ja, jag tänkte bara börja några minuter kort och bara berätta om oss och vilka vi är och vad vi gör. Och sen kommer vi byta språk till engelska för att prata om de globala konsekvenserna av kärnvapen som är fokus ikväll. Svenska Läkare mot... jag bara se, nu är min skärm som rör sig lite här. Så jag bara får ordning på det. Svenska Läkare mot kärnvapen, SLMK, är en förening med läkare som arbetar mot kärnvapen. Det är cirka 2500 medlemmar med framförallt läkare och läkarstudenter, men också några andra yrken som är associerade medlemmar, framförallt inom vårdyrken som sjuksköterskor, fysioterapeuter, tandläkare, men också forskare, ingenjörer som medlemmar. Och för oss som är engagerade i den här frågan så är det en självklarhet att just det här engagerar oss som läkare och oss inom vården. Och en del av det kommer vara fokus i dagens webbinarium. Och vad vi gör är att vi sprider kunskap om kärnvapen, om kärnvapens effekter, om medicinska och humanitära konsekvenser av kärnvapen. Och vi jobbar genom att bedriva påverkansarbete gentemot politiker och beslutsfattare i Sverige och internationellt. Och internationellt så är vi en del av International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, IPPNW, som bildades i skuggan av kalla kriget av två kardiologer, hjärtläkare, en från USA och en från dåvarande Sovjetunionen, som insåg att det största hotet mot dess patienter inte var hjärt- och kärlsjukdomar utan snarare kärnvapen, och bildade IPPNW, som fick Nobels fredspris 1985 för arbetet med att sprida information om just de medicinska konsekvenserna av kärnvapen. Och IPPNW tog initiativ till en kampanj som heter ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, för snart 20 år sedan, 2007. Och idag har ICAN vuxit och finns över hela världen i drygt 100 länder. Flera hundra organisationer som är del av den här kampanjen som har som mål att stigmatisera, förbjuda och eliminera kärnvapen. Och för det arbetet fick ICAN Nobels fredspris 2017. Så det är lite kort om oss och vad vi gör, och en del i allt detta vi gör är just föreläsningar eller webbinarium som ikväll. Vi hade ett liknande senast i våras när vi pratade lite mer om de direkta effekterna av de direkta medicinska konsekvenserna av kärnvapen. And then I think I will switch into English. Tonight our focus will be on the global effects of nuclear weapons and the climate effects of nuclear weapons. And we have, I would say, two very distinguished speakers with us tonight. First we have Dr. Ira Helfand, who's joining us from the US. And therefore we will do the webinar in English tonight. And Ira is member of the board of IPPNW and past co-president of IPPNW, and is also member of the steering group of ICAN. And Ira has published studies on the effects of nuclear weapons and had many lectures and speaks on this subject. So he's really an expert. And so is Dr. Gunnar Westberg, who is joining us from not as far away, but from Gothenburg. And Gunnar is also past co-president of IPPNW and been a member of the board of IPPNW for several years and past chair of SLMK and currently on the board of SLMK. And also a very experienced speaker on this subject. So really two experts tonight. So I think I will let you start and tell us basically a little bit about what will happen to this world if the unthinkable will happen. So please, Ira.
Thank you, Åsa, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. It's so difficult sometimes to recognize the problem that we're dealing with. Most of us, I think, on this call understand that there is a huge problem with nuclear weapons and that they pose a very grave threat to human survival. But the general population in most countries, including the United States, and I think also in Sweden, don't understand this. And so the historical mission of IPPNW and its affiliates like SLMK and PSR in the United States, our historical role has been to change that, to alert the public to the danger of nuclear war. And I think we played an enormously important role in the 1980s in building the movement that led to the end of the Cold War arms race. And we need to do that again today because the danger has returned. There are three messages I'd like to share with groups, and I was doing a lot of speaking recently to student groups. Three messages that I think that it's important that we bring to these groups. One is that nuclear war really can happen. This is not just something that we read about in history books. This is a real and present danger. Secondly, that if it does happen, it's going to be more catastrophic than we can possibly imagine. And third, and perhaps most important, it doesn't have to happen. We have a choice whether we're going to have a nuclear war or not. And we need to recognize that we have a choice. We need to make the right choice. So let me talk for just a few minutes about the danger, why I say, and I think we probably all agree, that nuclear war is a real threat today. Back in the 80s, we, all of us who were active then, alive then, understood this danger. It permeated society. There were books about nuclear war. There were movies about nuclear war. People had nightmares about nuclear war. And as a result of that intense awareness, an enormous number of people, millions in North America, in Europe, in Japan, in Australia, even in the Soviet Union, became politically active, demanding an end to the Cold War arms race. And all of that political activity paid off because we were successful. In 1983, the United States placed Pershing missiles in West Germany with the stated goal of being able to fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. This was a totally insane proposition, but it was US policy at the time. And the Russians took it very seriously. And they believed that the United States and NATO were preparing a surprise attack on the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And at this moment of extraordinary tension, we almost went to war twice, once in September and again in November. On both occasions, we literally came within minutes of a nuclear war that would have destroyed civilization as we know it. None of us would be here today. And yet, less than 2 years later, in large measure because of the enormous political movement that IPPNW helped to create, Gorbachev and Reagan sat down and said nuclear war can never be won and it must never be fought. And this was a complete change in the nuclear policy of both countries. So complete that I think most of us on hearing these words didn't think they were real. We thought they were just words, that this was not a real change in policy, but we were wrong. We had succeeded in bringing about a fundamental realignment of the nuclear policy of both countries. And it led to the dismantlement of tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, the end of the Cold War arms race, and in just a few more years, the end of the Cold War itself. The problem is that when the Cold War ended, we, all of us, began to act as though the problem had gone away. And it hadn't. Things were better. The world was clearly safer in the 1990s than it had been in the 1980s. But the problem hadn't gone away. there were still tens of thousands of nuclear warheads. And they were sitting there waiting for things to go bad again, which they have, unfortunately, to an extraordinary degree. To the point where in 2018, 7 years ago, the former US Defense Secretary, William Perry, warned us that the danger of nuclear war today, then, was greater than it had been during the worst moment of the Cold War. And he offered that assessment in the context of US-Russian relations. And it is important to recognize that he offered that assessment 4 years before the second Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has dramatically increased the danger of nuclear war, as we see with the flood of explicit nuclear threats that flow from the Kremlin. But US or NATO-Russia relations are not the only problem here. The United States and China are engaged in a very intense trade war. Relations between these two countries are the worst they have been since the 1970s. And there's every real possibility that there will be war between the United States and China. And if that happens, it will almost certainly involve nuclear weapons. The situation on the Korean Peninsula remains extremely dangerous. There's an emerging potential for nuclear arms race in the Middle East as Iran responds to the Israeli-US attack earlier this year, almost certainly trying to reconstitute its nuclear weapons program to match the nuclear weapons that Israel already has. And finally, there's a situation in South Asia, which is perhaps, in my view, the most dangerous of all. India and Pakistan have gone to war 4 times. There was a mini war between them earlier this year, lasted for 3 days, involved bombing on both sides of the border of airfields, some of which on the Pakistani side housed nuclear weapons. This could easily have escalated to a nuclear conflict, which would have been a catastrophe, not just for South Asia, but as I will talk about in a few minutes, for the entire planet. And in addition to these 5 geopolitical flashpoints, there are 2 other factors which are pushing us towards nuclear war. One is the climate crisis, which is making the planet less stable. And the climate crisis is going to progress, even if we do all the things we are supposed to do to try to control it. And as that happens, if nuclear weapons remain, the danger of nuclear war is going to grow. And finally, there is the rapid advance of cyber technology and the new plans to mate artificial intelligence devices with nuclear command and control systems, which I think dramatically increases the chance for an inadvertent nuclear war due to computer error or to hacking of computer systems. So for all of these reasons, we have to understand that we are literally at the brink of nuclear war in a way we have not been in many years, possibly to a degree that we have never experienced before. Given that, I think it's really important for us to understand what is going to happen if there is a nuclear war. And I think this is important because even as we've forgotten that the danger exists, we have also tended to forget how bad a nuclear war could be. In this 80th anniversary year of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we have seen many images of the destruction of both cities. And these images are powerful reminders of the power of nuclear weapons. But what we really need to understand about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for what will happen if nuclear weapons are used again. The Hiroshima bomb had the explosive force of 15 kilotons, 15,000 tons of TNT. It was an enormous explosion. But the weapons in the US and Russian arsenal today range in size from 100 to 800 kilotons. They are 6 to 50 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And in a large-scale war between the United States and Russia, it's not going to be one bomb on one city. It's going to be many bombs on many cities, again, each of which will be 6 to 50 times more powerful than Hiroshima. We don't know the exact targeting strategy of either the United States or Russia or China, because the war could involve any of these 3 countries. But what we do understand suggests that major target cities like New York, like Moscow, like Beijing, are targeted with anywhere from 10 to 15, possibly 20 bombs, again, each 6 to 50 times more powerful than Hiroshima. It is very hard to describe what it would look like to have all these bombs going off at the same time. And so I want to use a model of a single very large explosion to give us some idea of the danger that we're facing. This model assumes an explosion of 20 megatons. There used to be bombs that big. There aren't any more. We've discovered that you cause more damage by using many smaller bombs spread out over the area you're trying to destroy. The explosive force of this bomb is somewhat larger than we would expect even a large target city like Moscow or New York to experience. The destruction I'm going to describe is actually an underestimate because you cause, as I mentioned, more damage by using many smaller bombs. I'm going to use the example of New York because I happen to have good slides that show what happens to New York, and also because it has a very distinctive appearance that lets you see the distances involved. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this bomb, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this entire area, everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance, let me talk kilometers, to a distance of 6 kilometers in every direction. The explosion would generate winds greater than 1,000 kilometers per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude destroy anything that human beings can build. To a distance of 9 kilometers in every direction, the heat would be so great that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 25 kilometers in each direction, and note I've had to change the scale of this map to show this zone of destruction. To a distance of 25 kilometers in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, gasoline, heating oil, plastic, wood, it would all ignite, and you would get hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a giant firestorm, 50 kilometers across. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 800 degrees centigrade. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York, or Moscow, or Beijing, they're all about the same size. We're talking about 12 to 15, possibly 18 million people dead in a half an hour. And beyond the zone of total destruction, the disaster would continue because there would still be many people, hundreds of thousands in each case, with severe injuries, people who are blind from retinal burns from looking at the flash of light, people who are deaf because their eardrums have been punctured by the blast pressure, people with penetrating injuries from flying debris or crush injuries from being trapped inside collapsing buildings, and hundreds of thousands of people in each city with severe burns, second and third degree burns. All of these injuries would require intensive care, and it wouldn't be available because most of the hospitals would be destroyed, most of the medical personnel would be dead, most of the medical supplies would be used up. And if this took place as part of a war between the United States and Russia, or the United States and China, this kind of destruction would take place at every major city in the countries involved. And if NATO were drawn into the conflict, most of the great cities in Europe as well, including now with Sweden's new NATO membership, Stockholm, and probably Malmö and Gothenburg as well. All told, perhaps 300 million people dead in an afternoon. Those who survived in the countries that fought the war would find themselves in a hellscape that we cannot imagine. None of the things that we require to keep ourselves alive would be available. There would be no cell phones, no internet, no electric grid, no food distribution system, no public health system, no law and order. And in the months following this initial attack, most of the people in the countries which fought the war who survived the first day would also die. They would die from radiation poisoning, from epidemic disease, from starvation, and from exposure to the elements. But again, this is only part of the story because I've just talked about what happens in the countries that fight the war. This would be a catastrophe for the entire planet. All of these firestorms would lift enormous amounts of soot. In the case of a US-Russia war, 150 million tons into the upper atmosphere, into the stratosphere, where they would block out the sun and drop temperatures across the Earth, an average of 10 degrees centigrade. in the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures would drop 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. That's colder than it's been on this planet since the coldest moment of the last ice age 18,000 years ago. And under these conditions, most of the ecosystems across the planet, which have evolved since the end of that ice age, would collapse. Food production would stop, and most of humanity would starve to death. A study that was published in 2022 showed that in the first 2 years following a war between the United States and Russia, 3/4 of the human race, 6 billion people, would starve to death. That same study also looked at what would happen if a war took place in South Asia, and it found that there would be widespread radioactive contamination, 50 to 125 million people dead promptly, but again, global climate disruption. Not as severe as we would see with a war between the US and Russia, but bad enough to drop temperatures an average of 3.6 to 9 degrees, sorry, these are Fahrenheit numbers, and to cause, in the first 2 years, the death of 2 billion people by starvation. The study only looked at the first 2 years. The famine, in the case of a US-Russia war or a South Asian war, would continue, and we do not know what the ultimate death toll would be in either case. So this is the danger that we're facing, and which we really fail to acknowledge. I think all of us, even those of us who intellectually know this, have enormous trouble getting our arms around the fact that this could happen. But we need to do that, because if we don't, if these weapons continue to exist, it is not a question of if they're used. It is only a question of when they are used. We have been incredibly lucky. We have not survived this far into the nuclear weapons era because we knew what we were doing, because we had wise leaders, or sound military doctrine, or perfect technology. We've survived in the assessment of former U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara because, quoting him, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war, and no one's luck will last forever. That's the bad news, and there is a great deal of it. The good news is that none of this needs to happen. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. They are little machines that we've built ourselves. They're most warheads about the size of the chairs we're all sitting in right now. We've dismantled more than 50,000 of them. We know exactly how to get rid of the 12,000 that remain. We could do this in about 3 or 4 years once the decision were taken. It would not interrupt the daily life of people on this planet. We wouldn't even know it was happening except from reading about it in the press. It's an easy problem to deal with, and we can deal with it. And we need to know that. And I hope in the discussion we can come back to that question some. So let me pause here. Just in the United States, we have the slogan, physician social responsibility with regards to nuclear war. There is no cure, only prevention is possible. And we ask people to trust us because we're doctors. And I think that those of us in this movement who are physicians have a particular responsibility to share this information because people do tend to trust us. So let me pass the word to the very trustworthy Dr. Westberg, who will describe in more detail how this will all affect Sweden. Thank you.
Can you hear me? I cannot see myself, but maybe you can hear me. Anyhow, thank you, Ira. It was very good to hear you. Talking about the situation that we both have been through in all the years in the IBPNW, I'd like to stress again that the work is effective. The work has results. Remember in 1986, you talked about the danger of the intermediate nuclear forces in Europe that would make it possible to fight the nuclear war in Europe without having the United States involved. That was stopped by the enormous demonstrations, enormously big publicity against these Euro missiles, these intermediate forces in Europe, by people in the street protesting, and it had a great effect. when Gorbachev in 1986 said, a nuclear war cannot be won and it must never be fought, and so said Reagan. Gorbachev said, and has repeated it again, that was because of the information I got from the doctors and the scientists. And that was because of the nuclear winter that would come after the nuclear war. The winner, he who killed the most of the others, he will survive, he will die from starvation. And those who survive the first year after the war, maybe the second, they will envy the dead when they themselves are dying in the destroyed society and are dying in starvation. I don't know if I can switch the slide here. Anyhow, something specific about Sweden. In a big war between the United States and Russia and maybe China, the whole northern hemisphere, north of the equator, will be destroyed, and very few people, possibly no one, will survive there. And that applies to Sweden, of course, as to every other country. But let's talk about the small war, the one fought, for instance, between Iran and Israel, or between Pakistan and India. A very small war, only using less than 1% of the nuclear weapons in the world. Sweden will be more severely hit, more severely affected than most countries. Sweden is very vulnerable. We import almost 50% of our food nowadays. And next slide. I don't know if I can switch them or if someone else can. This is not a very good slide, but you can possibly see that in this year, I got really a very specific year, 2010, where an example when there be no trade in the world because of a war or because of very severe disturbances in international communications. Certain countries, say Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and specifically, or most importantly, Japan, there will be starvation if there is no trade of food that year. There will also be actually a problem in Norway, but not in Sweden. Why? Well, it happens to be year 2010 was the best year for harvest in Sweden in 20, 30 years. So that was exceptional. Can we have the next slide, please? When it's not exceptional, when there is no trade, there will be undoubtedly a lack of food in Sweden. And if we now look at the situation where you have a very limited nuclear war, India, Pakistan, bringing about 5 million tons of black soot into the atmosphere, there will be a cooling of the world for 7 years. And let's look at year 2 after the war. And if there is no trade, we don't get the importance of any food. And those countries who have possibilities like Japan, for instance, will hoard whatever food there is to buy. Next slide. In the nuclear famine, after just 5 TGs, 5 teragram there, in a year when there is no trade, and there is not an exceptionally good for year in Swedish cultivation, you will see there would be in Sweden very severe lack of nutrition, between 50 and 75% lower than normal. So there will be, I don't say that we will starve to death, but we will certainly lose weight very quickly, and there will be great danger in the country that we see that if this goes on for more years, which it will, there will be starvation, there will be famine. Norway has even more dependence on import than we do. And you can see certain countries, United Kingdom, for instance, but most importantly, China. China will have a very severe problem. There is not a very deep famine in the country, but it is a very big country, and they will certainly import whatever there is And if this starvation or this lack of food goes on for 7 years, a very large proportion of the people in China and in many other countries of the world will die. Next slide, please. So Sweden,
Gunnar, your mic is off. Sorry.
I didn't turn it off. It happened somehow. My microphone is on, it says.
Yes, it works now.
Okay, very good. Because we have such great dependence on trade, we will have very great difficulties, even if there is a very limited nuclear war, say India and Pakistan. If we get no import, and we have the colder summers, there will be less food production. Most importantly, something we don't remember is that the cultivation season in Sweden is very short. If you read the books from 100 years ago, remember how often there was frost in the fall, causing starvation in the country. Next slide, please. You can see if you have this war, India, Pakistan, with just 5 teragrams of soot in the air, the change in calorie production in Sweden will be only 30%. So it's not that severe. What is most severe is that their import will be completely, almost completely destroyed, because many other countries will buy whatever there is. In the bigger war, which Ira talked about, with, say, all the nuclear weapons in India, Pakistan being used, 16 teragram, we would have almost no food production in this cold country here in the subarctic area. Yes, that's about a 75% reduction. So if this goes on for several years, we will starve to death in Sweden. Unbelievable, but that's the way it is. Next slide, please. Nuclear famine is certainly a severe threat to health in Sweden, even in the very limited war. But that one, the 5 teragram India-Pakistan war, is the kind of crisis that we could mitigate, decrease the consequences of if we had proper preparation. For instance, if we had prepared ourselves with just stores of food, if we had a wider area available for cultivation next year than we have now, and if we had access to petrol and farming equipment and fertilizers. But in the example, which is more likely than the 5 to the 16 teragram war in Pakistan, we would have the famine causing people to begin to die from famine already the second year. This is something that the civil defense and the authorities in Sweden never ever talk about. I have been at MSB talking about this twice, and they listen with some interest, and then they go away and say it's not necessary. It will never happen, because there will never be a nuclear war. Okay, next slide. There is actually a goal in Sweden for a food independence by 2025, including that we should till more land and we should have a big storage of fertilizers and seed and so on. Nothing is done to make that goal a reality. Okay, thank you. That was actually the same slide, sorry. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, both Ira and Gunnar. We will open up for questions for both of you. And you could either raise a hand if you have questions, or write in the chat. That's okay as well. And let's see. Okay, is there a problem with the sound right now? Someone wrote that it's difficult to hear when it sounds like I'm speaking twice. Okay, what about the sound now? Is it better? Okay, looks like it. Well,
Good. Can I offer a comment, Åsa?
sure.
I think when we hear about all of this stuff, it's kind of numbing. The picture that we have to confront is so horrifying that there's something of an initial reaction that we just don't want to deal with this. And basically, I think that is what society has been doing for the last 5 or 10 years since the danger again became clear. I mean, those of us who survived the Cold War, I think were so relieved when it ended. We just told ourselves we're never going to think about this again. But I think one of our most important messages is the fact that as real as this danger is, and we do have to understand this is going to happen if we continue on the path that we're on right now, we really can intervene and do something about this. Here in the United States, we've started a national campaign to try to bring about the change in U.S. policy. We understand that the U.S. is a major part of the problem. And so we are trying to convince the U.S. government that it needs to adopt a new nuclear policy. The current policy of the U.S. and NATO as a whole is based on the idea that nuclear weapons make us safe. And we really need to challenge that. This whole idea of deterrence, that as long as we have nuclear weapons, no one will use them. Because we know how close we have come to nuclear war on so many occasions. And the policy needs to change, and it needs to be based now on the understanding that nuclear weapons may make us very strong, but they don't make us safe. In fact, they're the greatest threat to our safety. And we are urging the United States government to accept that new analysis of the nuclear situation, and therefore to proceed and to enter into negotiations with the other 8 countries which have nuclear weapons to try to come to an agreement to set forward the verification measures and the enforcement measures and a timetable for dismantling the rest of the nuclear weapons that these 9 countries together possess. We do this urge the U.S. to act in parallel with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, understanding that the U.S. will not sign and ratify this treaty unilaterally. It will require the other nuclear armed states to be part of the process. And so we're urging the U.S. government to begin that process, to get all 9 countries to reach an agreement so they can all 9 of them sign and join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I think Sweden has an enormously important role to play in this, an increased role now that it is a part of NATO. None of the countries in NATO have been participants in the TPNW process. Most have not even sent observers to the meetings to participate in the conversations informally. And were Sweden to, for example, come to the meeting of the state parties for the review conference for the TPNW next year, it would send a very powerful message. And that's what we need to be doing at this point. We need to be sending messages and getting this conversation going again so that people wake up to the danger as they did in the 80s and start taking action. So I am curious to know what the potential is in Sweden for moving your government to opposing my government, which is a big part of the problem.
I think maybe Gunnar had a comment on that. Did you?
Well, a very immediate comment is that certainly we must stop the possibility that nuclear weapons are transferred into Sweden. It is not prohibited at this time. There must be a law against it. And if Sweden signs TPNW, the treaty, that regulates that nuclear weapons cannot be transferred through Sweden. But the law is stronger than the treaty, and that is something we should work for in the upcoming election. But it's not. There are two parties who want to have that law. Let us remember them, tell them that they have to talk about it, fight for it.
Maybe can we repeat what parties those two are for everyone?
Miljöpartiet och Vänsterpartiet.
And how to get, do you have any idea how to get the rest of the political parties?
Well, if these two parties speak loudly about this, they will get some votes just for that. And then the Social Democrats might join the bandwagon and more or less say, yes, that's also what we want to, even though they may possibly add some delay to the procedure. But if they don't want to lose votes to the parties to the left, they have to join this.
And Ira, you said that you think that Sweden could play a great role in affecting the US in this matter.
I think if any country in NATO said we need to stop and think about this, what we're doing is crazy and wrong, it would have a huge impact. So far, none of the countries with which the United States has a nuclear alliance, NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia, have in any way indicated support for the elimination of nuclear weapons. They all are on board with the US plan and with the other nuclear weapon states' plans to maintain nuclear arsenals forever. And just any crack in that wall, I think, would start a conversation and would have a huge impact. The biggest problem we have right now, I think, is that no one's paying attention to this issue very much. I mean, in American politics, it doesn't come up really. In the last presidential election, Donald Trump, of all people, did mention the danger of nuclear war a couple of times, but it wasn't a substantial issue. Back in the 80s, that was a key issue in every presidential election. Who do you trust to be in charge of preventing, keeping the peace and avoiding nuclear war? And we don't have that situation now. We need to recreate it. Have people seen the movie A House of Dynamite? It's available. I don't know if is Netflix available in Sweden?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry. It's screening on Netflix right now, and it's an enormously powerful movie. It was made by a very prominent director, Catherine Bigelow, who is a superb filmmaker, and she focuses on the 20 minutes after a missile is detected by the U.S., having been launched from someplace in the Pacific, and how the U.S. responds to this over the 20 minutes until that missile would impact on a U.S. city. And it's just incredibly powerful. It's about 2 hours. It passes in about 15 minutes. You just cannot leave this movie once it starts. I think it's really useful for us to see ourselves, and really useful for us to try to get our government leaders to look at. Because like some of the movies in the 80s, it has the power to get through to these people and make them stop avoiding this issue, to end the denial that they're living in.
So there is a question in the chat for you, Ira. I don't know if you can see it, but how is the awareness opinion among the general public in the US about nuclear weapons?
It's not very good, but it is getting better. And there's been significant change in the last couple of years. This has become more of an issue, somewhat because of world events. People are shaken by the threats that Putin makes. There was a lot of attention for a brief period of time to the India-Pakistan war. And of course, there was attention in the US to the US attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities. So it's getting a little bit of attention that way. I think our efforts in trying to build a movement have had increasing success. We now have a student organization that has chapters at 25 high schools and colleges across the country. And that just started a year ago. It's been growing very rapidly. Our campaign, Back from the Brink, has a resolution in the Congress, which has got 40 members of the U.S. House of Representatives and 8 members of the U.S. Senate as co-sponsors at this point, which is really quite good. And we've passed resolutions in about 80 cities, including most of the major cities in the country. And then there have been a couple of movies. Oppenheimer had something of an impact. House of Dynamite has been very widely viewed in the United States and is having something of an impact. And there are a couple of other movies in the pipeline that will be coming out in the next year or two that will also, I think, help to focus people's attention. So some substantial progress, but a great distance still to go.
Recommending movies could be one way of getting more awareness. I haven't seen this House of Dynamite, but I heard a lot about it, so I think I will try to see it.
We've also been
is there anyone else who has any questions?
very powerful.
Gunnar, some comment?
Yes. When Gorbachev in 1986 and Reagan talked about the nuclear war can never be won and the survivors will end in the dead, they were referring to nuclear winter, to the nuclear darkness, the nuclear famine. And that is today forgotten. There was a 1-hour program about nuclear war in the Swedish national radio the other day. It's a very good program. Many of the aspects of the danger of nuclear weapons was there. Not a word about the climate effects. And when you read the Wikipedia, the English version, written, I suppose, by the US mostly, there is a very intense attempt to deny nuclear winter, nuclear darkness. Page up and page down, sometimes referring to nuclear winter as a Soviet invention. And as Ira and I agree on, it is a big problem that the importance of what happens to the victorious country, the one that kills most of the other side, that they will starve to death. That is something so important to bring to the attention in all the nuclear weapon states, and it's not there. Of course, we can never prove what will happen in that situation. You can never prove anything about the future. But all the science that have been done in the last 20 years point to more and more how important the consequences for the whole climate of the Earth, for the seas, the oceans, for decades to come after a nuclear war. And that must be brought home time and again. And in the US, there is, of course, a recurring tendency to say that nuclear weapons saved hundreds of thousands of US soldiers in Japan, and saved us from the Second World or the Third World War in Europe because of the nuclear weapons deterring the other side. So it's very difficult for you in the United States, but also for us in the Europe, to again and again bring out this message: a nuclear war can never be won. The surviving victorious party will starve to death.
I totally agree with that, Gunnar. And I think the implications of even a limited nuclear war are particularly powerful in that regard. Many people can't imagine the US and Russia going to war. They can, but it's hard for people to imagine. They find it easier to imagine that India or Pakistan might go to war. And when we're able to tell people in the United States that a war between India and Pakistan, over which we in the US have no control, would kill 130 million people here, which is the figure that has been come up with. And you in Sweden are able to point out to the fact that almost the entire Swedish population, more than 9 million people, will die if India and Pakistan go to war in a large-scale way. This is, I think, particularly shocking to people and frightening to people. And it makes them really understand the urgency of doing something about the situation. So I totally agree. I think getting people to understand the nuclear winter aspect of this crisis is terribly important, and probably will be the thing that turns the tide of public opinion.
Do any one of you have any idea how to bring this to attention to government or you mentioned the agency, Gunnar, like in Sweden, MSB, who is responsible for preparedness of crisis and really don't have any knowledge of this, or at least not paying attention to it. Like, for example, this folder that was sent to all households mentioned nuclear weapon in, was it 1 or 2 sentences, basically saying, go to shelter, stay for a couple of days, and then the radiation will be lower. How to raise this awareness among those who really should know this? Do you have any idea?
I mean, again, as I said about the excellent program on radio the other day, programs like that don't even mention the climate consequences. We'll have to remind them they have missed the most important aspect. Time and again, we'll have to be there.
Then we have another question in the chat. Do you see any alternative weapon to nuclear weapons? I think that is often something, an argument that comes up when you discuss nuclear weapons, that it's hard to eliminate the most powerful weapon, that the countries still want to have this thing that is the most powerful. But the question is, do you see any alternative weapon to nuclear weapons?
There certainly is no shortage of regular conventional weapons in the world today. And from the point of view, for example, of NATO countries, NATO has extraordinary superiority in conventional military forces, such that it would be much more secure in a world without nuclear weapons. This may be a problem for the Russians, who would feel that they would be in greater danger in a world without nuclear weapons. I think, though, that this point that Gunnar has been making about what happens to the victor in a nuclear war is one that really has to be driven home. It's understandable why people equate strength as provided by nuclear weapons with safety. During most of human history, this was true. If you had stronger weapons than your enemy, you probably were safer. And this is a message which I think we have all internalized to a great degree. If you find yourself walking down a dark street at night and somebody is coming towards you and they're carrying a big stick, you feel threatened. If you're carrying a bigger stick, you feel safer. The problem is that if your stick is a stick of dynamite that's going to kill you if you use it, then the logic of having a bigger weapon doesn't apply anymore. And that's the situation that we're in today. These weapons have to be understood to be suicide bombs. If we use, as Gunnar pointed out, our own weapons, the victor dies. And I think when we get people to understand that, the notion that, well, we need to have nuclear weapons really loses all of its power.
And then there is question, how will drones affect är det drönare, Eva?
Ja,
fråga.
Drones.
Drones, drönare.
Ja.
So how will drones affect nuclear risks? Do you have any comment on that?
I think drones have destabilized battlefields, and militaries are trying to figure out how to adapt to this new technology. And any time that there is that kind of uncertainty, it increases the danger. I'm especially concerned about the fact that drones are now being also mated with artificial intelligence. And there are plans to create drone swarms of hundreds or even thousands of small drones that would all be communicating with each other through AI. As a way of dominating a conventional battlefield. These are very powerful technologies, and I think the lesson we have learned from the last several hundred years of human history is that we are very clever at creating these technologies and we are not very wise at controlling them. I am very worried that unintended consequences of these new technologies will turn out to be very destabilizing and increase the danger that we're facing.
And then there is a comment that journalists are not experts and we need to educate them. And if you hear something in a program that there's an important fact missing, so write the journalist in question. That's, I think, a really good comment. And that's something that we try to do in SLMK, and it's a really good thing for everyone to do, to show that that there are more facts and that there are a lot of people that are concerned about these questions. Was there a question or just a comment? I think it was just a comment in that. Well, we're about to end. However, is there anyone else who would like to ask anything or comment anything?
Can I make a quick closing comment?
Of course.
You know, what we've been talking about is really horrible stuff. It's very frightening. The consequences, if we have a nuclear war, are unbelievably catastrophic. And I think what we really need to understand is our power in this situation. When we look at the enormity of this problem, I think each one of us thinks, what am I supposed to do? I'm one little person. And it's important to us to understand ourselves. No one of us is expected to deal with this alone. But each one of us does need to do that part of the job which is ours to do. And if we all come together and work through the communities that we already belong to, the networks that we belong to, if we each figure out how we can mobilize our friends and neighbors, and then each do our part, I think we're going to succeed. And it's not just a hope. It's the experience we had in the 1980s when we were able to build a movement that stopped what was a very clear progression to nuclear war, stopped it cold, and reversed course. So we know we can do this. We've already done it once before. And that is the challenge before us. Will we do it again? This is a big burden, being responsible for the fate of the earth. But, you know, we all want our lives to mean something. We want to do good things with our lives. We've been given the opportunity to save the world. And I think we really need to view the situation that way. If we all do what we're supposed to do, I personally am very optimistic that sometime in the relatively near future, maybe 5, maybe 10 years from now, we're going to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and say, quite honestly, I helped save the world. And that is going to be a very, very good thing. So let's move forward with good cheer and optimism.
Very good closing words. However, I would actually like to add something. I wasn't in this moment in the 80s, but we have done it later than that. And I would like to mention ICANN. When I started in this movement and in SLMK a little bit more than 20 years ago, I heard people talking about a treaty against nuclear weapons and that it would be impossible. It was so crazy to just think about it. And then we just did it. So you just try and try and try until you do it. And it is possible. It really is possible to change the world for the future. Well, so I hope everyone enjoyed our presentations, and that was hopefully everyone thought it was as interested as I think it is, and why this is really an important issue. Is there anyone else that would like to comment anything? Otherwise, I think we will wrap up very soon.
Det spelas in och kommer.
Will this presentation be shared somewhere?
Yes, as long as Ira and Gunnar is fine with it, it will be. We will have it probably on our webpage. I'm not sure, but it will be possible to see it afterwards. Okay, but then I would really like to thank both Ira and Gunnar for your presentations and for everyone joining us. And we will try to continue have this kind of webinars now and then on different aspects of the effects of nuclear weapons. And you can always check our webpage. And if you're not a member, it's possible to become a member. And also there are a lot of more information there to find out. Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation.